Christopher Benfey is Andrew W. Mellon Professor of English at Mount Holyoke College. He's the author of 5 books about the American Gilded Age, including A Summer of Hummingbirds, which won the 2009 Christian Goss Award of Phi Beta Kappa, and If, the Untold Story of Kipling's American Years. A frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books, Benfey is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and has held fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Please join me in welcoming Christopher Benfey.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you to the Manchester Public Library. It's great to be here to talk about Kipling's time here in Vermont. I published my book on the subject in 2019, so I'm now in the odd position of being less familiar with the book than anyone who has read it more recently. I want to begin with a few introductory remarks, general nuts and bolts stuff about Kipling and his reputation today. Then we'll get to the 5 hard questions I promised in my title. After that, I hope you'll ask a few hard questions of your own. I will get you warmed up, and then you'll give me the real hard stuff. During the past few years, I've often been asked what possessed me to write a book about Rudyard Kipling. Kipling is so out of fashion today, so in danger of being canceled forever, that it's hard to think of a less promising subject for a writer. One close friend warned me again and again that I should think twice before publishing a book about Kipling. Don't you realize, he said, his voice rising for maximum effect, don't you realize that Kipling is the most politically incorrect writer in the whole literary canon? He wasn't done yet, this friend of mine. He wondered whether I was prepared for the inevitable consequences and suggested darkly that I better have a good defense in place, some sophisticated scheme of damage control to deal with the ensuing outrage. So why did I write the book under such unpromising circumstances? 2 things first got me interested in Kipling. One was personal, and the other was professional. The personal thing was this: I went to high school at the Putney School, a little hippie school across the state, about an hour's drive from here. And just a few miles from the Putney School, high up in the hills above Brattleboro, was Kipling's house. I was reminded of its presence when my wife, who's here tonight, and I, to celebrate our 25th wedding anniversary, stayed at the 4 Columns Inn in Newfane, which we just drove by. That night over dinner, we got to talking to a nice couple at the adjacent table. We asked if they were staying at the inn, assuming they were, and they said no, they were staying at Kipling's house. We asked about Kipling's house. They explained a little bit about Nolaka. They suggested we should stop by on our way back to Amherst. And we did, and I was completely mesmerized. The idea that Kipling lived there above Brattleboro struck me as incredibly exciting and much more imagination prompting than all of the signs that, George Washington slept here. I did a little online research when Mickey and I got home to Amherst, Massachusetts, and I learned that for 4 years, from 1892 to 1896, Kipling lived right there on the Brattleboro-Dummerston line. He wrote The Jungle Book in the wolfless hills of Vermont. This seemed to me a rather startling and thrilling fact. The Jungle Book, Mowgli and Bagheera and Baloo, right there in Brattleboro. I was delighted to learn that very few people, even in New England, seemed aware that Kipling had lived and worked here in Vermont. I did find that many Vermonters knew that Kipling had lived in Vermont, but if you cross the border into Massachusetts, it's like crossing the river Styx. Like the memory is washed clean, and people say, Kipling? Vermont? You must be kidding. The perfect situation, I thought, for writing a book. It's always good to write about famous people who are not known for something remarkable. The second reason I got interested in Kipling's time in Vermont was professional. I'm an Americanist, and Kipling was a gigantic figure for American writers and readers during the 1890s and after. He was a kind of cult figure in the United States who was read by everyone, admired by just about everyone. From around 1890 to 1920, Rudyard Kipling was the most popular and successful writer alive, period, anywhere. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1907 when he was only 41. He remains the youngest winner ever of the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he was the first English language winner of the Nobel Prize. That same year, he received an honorary degree from Oxford, England, and marched to Oxford along with his idol, Mark Twain, and everyone was sort of admiring Kipling in the lineup. It can be difficult today to get a sense of just how loved and revered Kipling once was. The great American philosopher William James, author of Varieties of Religious Experience, the moral equivalent of war, William James came to Brattleboro to pay his respects to Rudyard Kipling. And William James said of Kipling, quote, "He's more of a Shakespeare than anyone yet in this generation of ours." More of a Shakespeare than anyone yet in this generation of ours. William James said this, by the way, to his own brother, the novelist Henry James. Little sibling rivalry there. Henry James, for his part, called Kipling, quote, "the most complete man of genius he'd ever known." Mark Twain was a good friend of Kipling. Parts of Kipling's house, including the billiard room in Brattleboro, were modeled on Mark Twain's extraordinary house in Hartford. And Mark Twain wrote of Kipling, "Kipling's names and Kipling's words stir me more than do any other living man's." Mark Twain said he reread Kim every year. The truth is that Kipling was many writers. He was a keen observer of the British in India, where he was born and where he grew up. It was there in India that he wrote The Man Who Would Be King, the remarkable story he wrote when he was 23 and that John Huston turned into a great anti-war film during the last years of the Vietnam War. Kipling was also, as I'm sure you all know, an incomparable writer for children. He also pretty much invented the modern spy novel with Kim. Then there's the bad news. Kipling was a passionate defender of the British Empire, not exactly a popular view in many parts of the world today, though imperialism recently got a little lift with the recent death of the Queen. Kipling was also, alas, the poet of that racist screed, The White Man's Burden. The White Man's Burden was explicitly addressed to Americans to assume the burden of empire handed from England to America, an invitation to occupy the Philippines in 1899. The day after Kipling published The White Man's Burden in the New York Times, the U.S. Senate voted exactly as he wished, to occupy the Philippines and remain there until World War II. George Orwell said The White Man's Burden should have been called The Black Man's Burden, and James Baldwin later agreed. The major focus of my book is what I call Kipling's American Decade. Kipling first visited the United States in 1889. He traveled from west to east, reaching San Francisco by ship from Japan. The first thing he noticed in San Francisco Harbor, in San Francisco Bay, he said, a couple of gunships could take over this port pretty easily. Beginning his travels from San Francisco, he then traveled across the continent to New York and Boston. His comparisons are wonderful. He thought Arizona looked a little like Afghanistan. Chicago reminded him predictably of Calcutta, very crowded, very smelly with all those cows in the streets. He insisted that all the American women he met were just like Louisa May Alcott's Little Women, and he was determined to marry one of them. Very systematically, he considered a set of American women he knew, and finally settled on an American woman named Carrie Balestier. Her family happened to have a house in Brattleboro, Vermont, and it was there that the Kiplings settled in 1892 after losing all their money in a bank failure when they were in Japan on their honeymoon, and they remained in Vermont for 4 years. Okay, so much for my little appetizer. Now we have to get to the 5 hard questions. I want to preface my questions with one qualifier. Biographers generally hide behind a certain tone of voice. Authoritative, know-it-all, confident. The voice I've been using for the last 15 minutes or so. And for the rest of the evening, I want to speak in another voice. A little less certain, maybe a little more honest, maybe a little more waffling, as I try, with your help, to figure out what I really think of Kipling and his time in Vermont. Deal? So let's bring that Wizard of Oz out from behind the curtain. So the first question, why did Kipling end up in Vermont? How did he end up here? Why Vermont? So there are 2 basic answers here. As I said, the usual answer is that Kipling fell in love with a Brattleboro girl, but that's too simple. The real answer is more complicated and reaches farther back in time. The reason Carrie Balestier's grandparents first came to the United States was because of the rebellion of enslaved people in Santo Domingo, the very famous slave rebellion led by Toussaint Louverture. The Balestiers left their plantation behind, eventually settling in Rochester, because the white plantation owners were kicked out of the island with the revolution. Like many Americans with European tastes, the Balestiers liked to take the waters at elegant spas. And Brattleboro, I feel like saying believe it or not, but it's not that hard to believe. Brattleboro was an elegant spa town, very much like Saratoga Springs. There were mineral spas. There was a whole operation led by a German doctor. You always need a German doctor at these water cures. There was music played in the hills, and a lot of people came from Boston and from the South and from the rest of New England to take the waters at Brattleboro. And among those people were the Balestiers, and they ended up buying land above Brattleboro. And that's where Carrie and Rudyard acquired land from them. So that wasn't so hard. I realize that's not really a hard question. Why did Kipling end up in Vermont? So how about this one? Was Kipling's wife really as horrible as her reputation? I realize that's a nasty sounding question with a misogynist ring to it. I could have asked, what was Kipling's wife like? But the published sources on Carrie Kipling are pretty hostile. There's a whole biography about her, and it is titled The Hated Wife. I brought it because I knew you wouldn't believe me if I did. Carrie Balestier was not regarded as the pretty Balestier sister, nor was she regarded as the nice Ballister, sister. Friends and family could not understand how Rudyard Kipling suddenly ended up engaged to Carrie Ballister. Besides, the Kipling sibling whom Kipling really loved was the nice Ballister brother, Walcott Ballister. Walcott and Kipling were so tight, they wrote a novel together. Half of it was set in the West, where Walcott had hobnobbed around the mining towns in the West, and half of it was set in India, and it had a romance. But the real romance was between Walcott and Kipling. Walcott set up a publishing operation where he could get publishing rights to American writers and protect copyright in England, started a publishing empire, and then he died of typhoid in Dresden, and Kipling showed up from halfway across the world and promptly married Carrie. I'm telescoping a lot of time together. Henry James, who gave the bride away at the wedding, described Carrie as, quote, rather manly. Kipling's own father said that strong-willed Carrie, quote, would have made a good man. It's not clear what entirely it was Carrie would have made a good man. When she was married to Kipling, she was hated in Brattleboro because she put on airs. She was hated because she forced her housemaids to wear British outfits. She was hated because she wouldn't let journalists or anyone else into the house to see Kipling. And she was hated because she quarreled with her drunkard but very popular brother, Beatty Ballister, who was a great favorite in Brattleboro. Basically, she was hated. I'm a Carrie fan. So, is there a defense for Carrie? I think there is. The defense is pretty simple. She was the perfect wife for Rudyard Kipling. Or Ruddy, as she called him. She was his protector. She was a ruthless gatekeeper, tasked with letting no one into his study who would distract him from his work. She took care of the finances. She took care of the buildings and grounds. She once burned herself horribly while fiddling with a huge furnace in the basement of Nolaka. She raised the children. She was unfailingly supportive of her husband and unfailingly believed in his greatness. The good wife, certainly, to a certain standard, she was. So I would call this like the good wife. Make a series of it. Yeah. That was a hard question. So the third question, and this was, I think, advertised, so maybe that's why all of you are here tonight. Was Kipling an American writer? Since this is a major argument of my book, I'm going to say yes. Yes, Kipling was some kind of serious American writer. As a young man, Kipling cultivated American influences. When he was in high school, he claimed that Walt Whitman was his favorite poet, an unusual choice for a young fellow in an English boarding school. He also read and reread Mark Twain. On his first trip to the United States, he made a pilgrimage to see Mark Twain, all the way to Elmira, New York. And he later modeled his novel Kim after Huckleberry Finn. A photograph of Ralph Waldo Emerson, whose essay Self-Reliance Kipling adopted as his own personal creed and versified into his most famous poem, If, adorned his writing desk. So every time Kipling sat down to write, there was Ralph Waldo Emerson staring at him. If you don't remember If, I'll give you the last stanza. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings, nor lose the common touch, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, If all men count with you, but none too much. If you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and which is more, you'll be a man, my son. This poem has a sort of cult significance at Wimbledon. The lines about looking at triumph and disaster and treating those two pretenders just the same are written above the entrance from the dressing room, from the locker room into the center court. And Serena Williams once I think you can see Serena Williams reciting "If" on YouTube. And at the end, of course, he has to adjust the "and which is more, you'll be a woman, my daughter," or something like that. One reason Kipling so loved southern Vermont was that Emerson had mentioned Mount Monadnock in one of his poems. So Kipling felt that Vermont had been ratified by one of his idols. So, to put it briefly, during his time in the United States, Kipling apprenticed himself to American writers. He studied American politics. He told several people in Vermont that he was going to write, quote, the great American novel. I think his book, Captain's Courageous, was his attempt to write the great American novel. When he was forced to leave Vermont in 1896, he wrote, quote, there are only two places in the world where I want to live, Bombay and Brattleboro. And I can't live in either. So yes, an American writer. It's such a wonderful line, and I don't think he meant it as a laugh line. He thought everyone would say, yeah, come to think of it, yeah, Bombay or Brattleboro. Yeah, the circumstances, if you're interested in the circumstances of Kipling's very sudden departure from Brattleboro, I mentioned that his wife feuded with her brother, Beatty Balestier. And the Kiplings hired Beatty to take care of their fields, to hay their fields and tend the gardens. And Beatty was a slackard and a drunk. And Carey got more and more insistent that Beatty wasn't doing his work. And there was more and more tension. And one day, Kipling was riding his bicycle. Kipling had learned how to ride a bicycle, much to the scorn of Beatty. Kipling was riding his bicycle near Naulaka, and Beatty came around the corner driving his horses. And Beatty said, you've been insulting me in town. And Kipling sort of steered his bicycle and fell and then denied it. And they almost came to blows. And Kipling went into Brattleboro and called for his brother-in-law's arrest for assaulting him. And Beatty was duly arrested. There was a trial. It was attended by people from all over New England. And Kipling was just absolutely mortified by this and said to Carey, we've got to get out of here. It was immediately clear that the sympathies of the crowd were entirely with Beatty and not with Ruddy. I'm just avoiding my hard question number 4. Was Kipling a great writer? Now things get complicated. As I run for cover, I'm going to say, well, yes, of course he was a great writer. The implied question behind the question is something like this. Can someone with such horrible, reactionary, inexcusable political views really be a great writer? There have been many attempts to answer the question positively, most famously in W.H. Auden's lines, time that with this strange excuse pardon Kipling and his views, and will pardon Paul Claudel, pardon him for writing well. So time that with this strange excuse, pardon Kipling and his views, and will pardon Paul Claudel, reactionary French Catholic poet and dramatist. Pardon him for writing well. Very moving lines. They make the argument very strongly, and Auden later regretted the stanza and deleted it from his elegy for W.B. Yeats. Auden's argument is that you can separate the artist from his politics. We still read T.S. Eliot this year on the 100th anniversary of The Wasteland, despite T.S. Eliot's rabid anti-Semitism. We still listen to Wagner's music, same problem. We still admire Picasso's paintings because of that Me Too disaster. Mark Twain liked young girls. Mark Twain hated Native Americans and fought for the Confederacy. That Mark Twain? Then again, in 100 years, our great-great-great-grandchildren, I'm just guessing, how many our great-great-great-grandchildren in 100 years will be amazed that we raise animals to eat, that we wore leather belts, that we wore leather shoes, and drove cars powered by fossil fuels. Did you really, great-great-granddaddy? Yes, I did. But I had many excuses. I had to hold up my pants. Other defenders of Kipling say that he was sometimes offensive, but not always so. That was John Huston's view. Kipling was a passionate defender of imperialism. On the other hand, he wrote The Man Who Would Be King, which is a completely anti-imperialist fable, and fit in perfectly with John Huston's very left-wing sense of predatory imperialists. My own argument for thinking kind of in my waffling way that yes, Kipling was a great writer is that Kipling lasts. Great writers last. The Jungle Book isn't going anywhere. Many more movies will be made of The Jungle Book. There were 2 very recent ones. There will be more very soon. Kim isn't going anywhere. Magnificent novel. Neither is the poem If. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. My father, who grew up in England and is now 97, he said, oh, I remember If. If you can keep your wife when all around you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. I said, no, that's not. He said, isn't that how it goes? So Kipling is also one of the most parodied writers in the English language. Kipling is also the inventor of many phrases that are part of the language we speak. George Orwell said that only Shakespeare gave more phrases to the English language, familiar phrases, than Kipling. Whenever we say, but that's another story, that's a Kipling line that Kipling made very famous in his early stories. That's another story. And you all know that Never the Twain Shall Meet does not refer to Mark Twain, Kipling's attempts to meet him, but comes from Kipling's poem, East is East and West is West, and Never the Twain Shall Meet. Number 5. Was Kipling a racist? Now things get even more complicated. Kipling certainly divided the people of the world along racial lines and ethnic lines. Like most of his contemporaries, he believed that race at least partly determines character. His stories are full of stereotypes, often really excruciating stereotypes. Sometimes he is very positive about people of color. He greatly admired Muslims, for example. He wrote very admiringly about Muslims in his novel, Kim. and in his poem Gunga Din, turned into another famous movie. Kipling admired Native Americans and quarreled with Teddy Roosevelt when the two men visited the American Indian exhibits at the Smithsonian. Teddy Roosevelt was banging the glass cases and explaining why the Indians had to be exterminated. And Kipling was saying, but they're magnificent and they're wonderful people, and we have Indians that we didn't exterminate in India, et cetera, et cetera. Then again, Kipling barely seemed to notice that there were black people in the United States. He became a very great booster of South Africa, a very close friend of Cecil Rhodes, and it never occurred to him that black people should have any role in the leadership of South Africa. He voiced contempt for Abraham Lincoln for letting so many white Anglo-Saxon men die in the Civil War. Is there a defense here? And I think the answer here has to be no, there is no defense. So I guess my one mild point about Kipling's racism is that Kipling held the views of many of his contemporaries. So what? He also knew a far, far wider range of people from all over the world than someone like Henry James or Emily Dickinson, or even, indeed, Mark Twain, who did do some traveling around the world. Kipling traveled around the world over and over and over and made it his business to meet as many different kinds of people in the world as he possibly could. Then he did sort them out according to categories and stereotypes and so on. I do find myself shuddering at the thought of what someone like Henry James would have said in Africa or Japan if given the chance. So, should Kipling be canceled for his racism and imperialism? I think you know my answer here since I wrote a whole book about him, but that was before Donald Trump, before George Floyd, before the January 6th insurrection, before the invasion of Ukraine, and okay, what about your hard questions? Yes?
I'm thinking on the question of Kipling's racism.
Yes.
He was a man of his time. And, you know, I think Darwin was around that time too.
Yes.
And he actually thought that Africans were subspecies.
That's right.
So I'm just saying, if these things evolve.
Yep.
And to really hang the racist, the negative racist label on a writer of so many broad things, so many different things, it's kind of hard, I think.
So that was my...
It's an easy label.
No, exactly, and that's why I sort of mumbled under my breath that Kipling held the views of many of his contemporaries. And even, you know, even the charge of imperialism, it's obvious that Kipling was an imperialist. He said so. He regarded himself as a defender of imperialism. But even anti-imperialists like William James, you know, one of the leaders of the Anti-Imperialist League, you know, William James continued to admire Kipling greatly. Mark Twain was also an anti-imperialist. But they had very nuanced views about what empires were good and what empires were bad. Mark Twain went to India. He wanted Kipling to be his guide there, and Kipling said, I really, you know, I can't go back to India. And Mark Twain thought that the British in India were really magnificent. He was really impressed with them. He thought they were doing a great job with India. And Mark Twain was a strong believer in the United States liberating Cuba and Panama and the Philippines, but what he objected to was occupying the Philippines, so sort of making these kinds of distinctions. But absolutely right, Kipling shared the views of many, 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 many of his contemporaries, including Darwin. And as you said, we like to believe that we progress in our views. Yes?
When he left Brattleboro, they left Brattleboro, what happened after that? Did he go back to England? Or?
Yeah, so we think of Kipling as an English writer, but really, he hadn't really lived in England for very long. You know, his early years were in India. He was born in Bombay, that city that he wanted to go back to. He briefly lived in England apart from his parents in a foster family, a really horrible experience for him. He was abused by his foster parents. He had bad eyesight, and they thought he was just stubborn and was refusing to read and so on. And his parents didn't have money to send him to college, so he returned to India and became a professional journalist and an editor, and lived in India again until he was in his late teens and early 20s, and then he began traveling around the world and settled in the United States. So he really didn't know England all that well. And after the blow up in Brattleboro, compounded by tensions between the United States and Great Britain over Venezuela, there was an argument about the boundary of Venezuela that, as with most boundary disputes, had to do with the discovery of gold in that region of Venezuela. And the United States and the United Kingdom almost came to the point of war in that squabble in 1896. And Teddy Roosevelt said, "This is great. Maybe we can take over Canada." I mean, Teddy Roosevelt is an amazing figure in every way. But the combination of the Venezuela dispute and Kipling discovering that all his neighbors had these very anti-British views, he and Carrie moved to England to the first of a sequence of houses, and they ended up living until Kipling's death in Sussex in a sort of isolated country house where he didn't have to deal with other people. And that's when he becomes much more of an Englishman. He did return to the United States once, and it was mainly so Carrie could see her mother and so that the Brattleboro people could see the Kipling's children. And the whole Kipling family came down with the flu, and Kipling and his beloved daughter, Josephine, were very close to death in a New York house, and Kipling finally pulled through, and Josephine, who was 8 at the time, Kipling's first daughter, his beloved American daughter, died of influenza. And Kipling left for England, and he said, I will never return to the United States. The first of Kipling's disastrous family losses. His son, John, was eager to enlist in World War I. Kipling pulled strings so that John, as a 17-year-old, could join the Irish Guards. John arrived at the Battle of Loos, and on his first day was blown to bits by a German shell. No part of him was ever found. And at that point, Kipling began to rethink some of his pro-war views. And he wrote a beautiful series of anti-war poems, one of which also begins with "if," and it's spoken by dead soldiers, and one of them says, if you would ask us why we died, tell them because our fathers lied. Next hard question. Yeah.
I think, going back to Kipling's poetry, and if Christ's admiralty is blood, Lord God, repay the cost.
Yeah.
And Recessional, which was written for Victoria's Jubilee, is probably one of the great cautionary tales.
Do you know it by heart?
Virtually.
You want to try it?
No. But the other thing, I want to disagree with you mildly on
Do it.
his Englishness. He had spent a lot of time in his prep school years in the part of Sussex that he had ultimately settled.
That's right. That's right.
And there was a brilliant singer-songwriter, British, who sent a lot of Kipling to Sussex tunes, typically from the Copper family.
Yeah.
And when you hear those poems set to those tunes, it's stunning. It's like hearing Kipling for the first time.
Yeah. No, that's well said. And Kipling did have, he loved the musicals. And in London, he did love the music. His barrack room ballads, poems of ordinary soldiers, fighting in India, fighting in Afghanistan, are wonderfully set to music or not set to music. As this gentleman said, around the time Kipling wrote The White Man's Burden, he wrote a very beautiful poem for the Queen called Recessional, which takes almost the opposite view. It's a warning about overreach in international affairs, and it begins, God of our fathers, it's also often sung as a hymn, God of our fathers, known of old, Lord of our far-flung battle line, beneath whose awful hand we hold dominion over palm and pine. Lord God of hosts, be with us yet, lest we forget, lest we forget. And one more line. Far called our navies melt away, on dune and headland sinks the fire. Lo, all our pomp of yesterday is one with Nineveh and Tyre. Judge of the nations, spare us yet, lest we forget, lest we forget. A much more anxious, beautiful poem, one of T.S. Eliot's favorite poems, that has a very different sound to it and seems to prefigure Kipling's later awareness of the horrors of war. Another hard question. I'm sorry to be so glib about my hard questions. Let's have another one. Yes?
Are there any of his descendants still in the Brattleboro area that you know of?
No, there are no descendants, period.
Oh, none, because the two kids?
Yeah, two kids, and the third, the daughter who survived, did not have children, so there are no direct descendants. Yeah, the family life, I mean, this man who adored his children and wrote not only The Jungle Book, not only Just So stories, not only Puck of Pook's Hill, which is very much the Sussex archaeological origins, early origins, and so on of that part of Sussex. All of those were written for his children and take his children as characters. Kipling is one feels silly saying it, an incomparable writer for children. It's hard to think of a more significant one in English.
So you mentioned initially that he was in love with this man. Was it a homosexual relationship or just a friend?
I think a homosocial, a relationship that was as intense emotionally as it could possibly be. People who knew Kipling just felt that this was the friendship of his life. He wrote a beautiful poem called Song of the Open Road, which is a sort of call to get out on the open road. And he said, you know, join me, dear lad. It was dedicated to Walcott and the idea that they would go off on their adventures together. And as soon as Walcott died, Kipling changed the word lad to lass and gave it to Carrie. He was in love with the family. He wanted all of it. And I think that was part of the heartbreak of the fight with Beatty and really the fight with Brattleboro, that he had felt that he was some kind of American, that he was fully at home on the Dummerston line, that this was going to work out. And, you know, I guess one would say, I mean, I'm thinking back to the point about Kipling's Englishness versus his non-Englishness. He was a man of what he called the dominions. He was very clear about that. The dominions were in some sense English, but they weren't quite England. And in some ways he turned Sussex into one more dominion, one more place. He didn't like London, you know, one more place that was sort of on the fringes of empire. But he loved South Africa. He was very intrigued with Canada. He liked the United States as a sort of interesting formal colony, kind of part of the same world of dominions. He was intrigued by New Zealand and Australia and wrote about them and went to them. He went to all these places, this indefatigable traveler. My wife is saying, when's he going to be done with these? What? Another hard question.
So he made enough money during his lifetime with his writings to do all this traveling?
Yeah, he made enormous amounts of money as a writer. As I said, his first sort of flush with cash moment was dashed when he and Carrie got to Japan, and they were going to go all the way around the world and meet Kipling's family in India, and it was going to be great. And a bank failure in 1892 just wiped out all of his savings. I mean, this happened in the United States. There was cascading bank failures in the early 1890s, devastated Vermont. And so Kipling returned to Vermont determined to make money. And that's when he began writing for American magazines and writing children's stories and republishing the stories he'd written set in India. He became a very close friend of Nelson Doubleday, the founder of the Doubleday firm, and the books were all republished very well and very successfully. Yeah, Kipling, he was a hugely successful writer, the most successful writer anyone had ever seen.
Did he always have an American publisher? Or was
Yes.
Who
Yes.
spread it worldwide?
Yes, and as many of you know, the international copyright laws were very slow to get established. So there was a lot of travel to England by writers just to reestablish copyright, just to, to be personally there to establish copyright. Mark Twain was obsessed with pirated editions. Kipling was pirated all over the world. But yes, and Walcott had this vision of simultaneous publication. He was a very shrewd sort of agent publisher. So part of Walcott and Kipling's intimacy was that
Did he have an editor?
financial relationship. Did he have an editor?
Yeah,
Yeah, well, all of these, all the magazines had editors, but I've looked at Kipling's manuscripts and what they were set from, and nobody messed with them. I should mention that that Naulahka, the name of the house in Brattleboro, is also the name of the novel that Walcott and Kipling wrote together. It's a novel that nobody reads, though some scenes from it were borrowed by the Indiana Jones series. So the pit with the snakes and the moving rocks, there are a lot of things that were adopted in the silent movie versions of Naulahka and then just kept being a part of these sort of standard movies about exotic quests for grails and diamonds and so on. It is a very valuable necklace that is the goal of the seekers in Naulahka. So Naulahka was built as a monument and a memorial to Walcott Ballister, Kipling's closest friend. Yes?
What's the status of his home in the land in Brattleboro now?
You can rent it. You can stay there. The status, it is owned by an American operation called the Landmark Trust. And the Landmark Trust acquires historic properties with the idea of preserving them and making them available for rental. I think there's a minimum rental of maybe 3 nights. They have several properties, including the Scott Farm, where I was just told the Cider House Rules was filmed, so you can go and be there. I've spent the night a couple of times in Kipling's bed, and woke to the sunrise over the Monadnock-ish, not quite Monadnock in the distance. It was very moving to stay there. It is a haunted house, so for the price of rental, you also get the ghosts. One more question as we approach 8 o'clock. How about a softball question, an easy question? Do we have some readers of Kipling here? I'll ask the hard questions. You're a reader. Yeah. What's your favorite thing?
What makes the
Man
big
would
man
be king.
close?
Man would be king.
Man Who Would Be King.
I really like that.
Me too.
And
That's,
then the movie was really
Ricky Tikki Tavi.
I love Ricky Tikki Tavi.
right.
I just love it to death.
How much is it being taught in college?
Not in the least. No, Kipling is really gone from college. Chem is sometimes still taught in courses in which imperialism is addressed.
How about the children's books?
Not in college, no. I think Ricky Tikki Tavi is about Kipling. There are many that it's a self-portrait of being adopted into a family, but I think the Ricky is R.K. There are many names in Kipling's books that seem to be plays on his own initials. But Ricky Tikki Tavi, the story of the mongoose and the evil cobras, it's...
Yeah, I think the best of those is Stocky and Company. I mean, that's
Yes. Yeah, Stocky and Company set in the public school that this gentleman mentioned. It's a great book about young boys getting mixed up with all kinds of stuff. It's hard, and it's especially hard for American readers, but it's beyond brilliant. One story, this will make you all want to read Stocky and Company. One story is about teaching a particularly difficult ode of Horace in Latin, and the shenanigans of the students who are having trouble translating it. You'll just have to take my word for it. It's brilliant. Maybe not as much fun as Ricky Tikki Tavi. Thank you all very much. I've had a good time. Thank you.